How We Won by Charlotte T. Zitlow, Chapter 5. The Primaries, the Founding of a Better Way. Conventional political wisdom in the 60s was that Monroe was a Republican county and Bloomington a Republican city. Election results from 1966 on had borne that out, although U.S. Senator Birch Bayh carried the county in 1968 and there were a few Democrats in office, notably David Rogers in the state Senate, County Assessor Charlie Packard, and County Treasurer John Davis. The victories in 1970 of Vance Harkey for Senate, Marion Gottfried, and Warren Henniger for County Council, and most importantly, the election of Jamie Murphy as County Clerk, gave the reorganized County Democratic Party's chair and precinct committee people reason for hope in the 1971 city election. Simultaneously, a number of local citizens came together, each for his or her own set of reasons, with a fervent desire to participate in the creation of a more citizen-friendly government. They brought their pasts, their experiences, and their expertise to the table and found like-minded colleagues all ready and raring to go, with a willingness to pool their political resources. Nearly all of the Democratic candidates for city elected offices in 1971 had moved to Bloomington during their adult lives. This distinguished them immediately from their Republican opponents. They could not claim to have lived here all their lives, and most of them did not have lengthy records of service to the community, their churches, or to local government. They were novices, and they did not pretend to hide that. What they did claim was a serious interest in what was going on in the city and a vision of what they hoped to change. There were primary challenges in most of the districts, and they hoped to set the scene for the general election. The most visible and most hard-fought primary race in the Democratic side was the race for mayor, which pitted former mayor and native Bloomingtonian Tom Lemon against Frank McCloskey, a relative newcomer. The new county chair, Ed Tracy, had been brought up politically by Tom Lemon and was committed to supporting him. Tom had been mayor in the 50s and left office in 1960, shortly after having been reelected in 1959 to take appointed position of postmaster in Cincinnati after the election of John F. Kennedy. He had been a very effective mayor, spearheading the damming of Bean Blossom Creek to create a reliable water source for Bloomington. This was a critical development, and the dammed reservoir was subsequently named Lake Lemon after him. He was a realtor and native and generally well-liked. His campaign tactics included handing out lemon drops from the endless supply in his pocket. He was an effective, comfortable down-home politician, and he wanted to get back in the thick of things after losing his first comeback race in 1967 to Jack Hooker. Frank McCloskey, on the other hand, was far from the typical Southern Indiana mayor. He hailed from South Philadelphia, an Irish Catholic from a tough neighborhood who had joined the Air Force out of high school. After 4 years of service, including time at Wheeler Air Force Base in Libya, Frank returned to the City News Bureau in Chicago as a reporter and moved to Bloomington shortly thereafter. He started working as a stringer for the Indianapolis Star and a reporter for the Herald Telephone. His wife, Roberta, the daughter of an Army officer, and he had 2 small children. After settling in Bloomington, Frank took classes at IU, earning his BA in 1968 and graduating from the law school in 1971. At the time of the mayoral primary, Frank was studying to take the bar examination. How did Frank end up running for mayor, especially against an iconic politician like Tom Lemon? He was a very smart fellow and very interested in politics at many levels. As a reporter, he had covered local government, and he had a personal vision of making a difference. In the 1970 election for state representative, there was no candidate rising to run from the ranks of the local Democratic Party. Frank was a clerk at the time for the firm in which David Rogers was a partner with Leroy Baker. Their firm also shared offices with Richard Wilder, owner and editor of the Democratic-leaning weekly The Star Tribune. Rogers was a state senator with deep roots in the community and very invested in finding a viable candidate for one of 2 seats in the multi-member district to run against Steve Ferguson. Rogers and a few of his Democratic lawyer friends, including Wilder and Baker, scouted around for a local candidate and, coming up short, asked Frank, their law clerk, to sign up for the race. Frank did, and ran an impressive race, but failed to win the seat. Nevertheless, his obvious zest and talent for campaigning caught everyone's attention. His wife, Roberta, discovered an extraordinary talent for political organization and worked on precinct lists methodically and relentlessly to great effort. When Tom Lemon, who had failed to win back the mayoral seat in 1967, announced that he was going to challenge Jack Hooker again, the Rogers Wilder Baker contingent urged Frank to run. While he was overwhelmed with graduating from law school, taking the bar, and earning a living, Frank readily took the challenge. He saw an opportunity to get involved, and he took it. The stage was set for a classic battle between the old guard and the new, with powerful traditional forces behind each candidate. The mayoral race would be a bellwether for things to come. As unlikely as it may have seemed at the time, Frank won 2,350 votes to Tom Lemon's 1,285. Bob Clennington, the lone incumbent Democrat on the city council, came in distant third with 234. McCloskey, the new kid on the block, won over Lemon by a margin of 1,065 and over the two opponents together by 831. Frank took nothing for granted, campaigned relentlessly, and followed the brilliant lead of his wife's organizational and tactical direction. But all of these machinations were totally unknown to the majority of us who would end up as candidates for city council, city clerk, and city court judge. We all fell into the race from our own idiosyncratic directions, most of us not having started 1971 with the intention to run for public office. Alfred, Al Towle, was brought up in Louisville, Kentucky, the son of a Baptist minister and a boy evangelist in his own right. A gifted student, Al attended Male High School in Louisville and got a scholarship to Yale University, where he studied philosophy. He was fascinated with figures as well and found himself working at IU's Rubel Computing Center in the early days of the global transition to electronic data processing. Al was one of the few of us who started off 1971 with the intention of running for city council seat in the 2nd District. Together with a number of colleagues at Rubel and a few other adherents, he helped organize the IU Voters Union in 1970. The nonpartisan group unapologetically preached liberal policies and based their political strategies on voting data patterns and facts. A master of organization, Al had a clear agenda in mind, and it reflected the views of other VU members as well. By the time the Democratic slate was formed in the primary election, this agenda had become the consensus of virtually all of the Democratic candidates and gave the general election campaign focus. However, the VU did not identify itself as a Democratic organization because it reserved the right to state its own values and positions and to endorse candidates from any party. Al Towle's agenda merged closely with the VU agenda and became the basis for eventually adopted campaign theme, A Better Way. Al's opponent in the primary was Jim Medlock, a real estate agent and a longtime local Democrat. Jim was an amiable sort, not militant in his support of the status quo, but he did vote for Tom Lemon. Jim had a folksy touch, and he was certainly considered a homegrown fellow. Towle won by a margin of 45 votes, but in a 304 to 259 race that represented a comfortable 8% margin. While Jim lost the primary, his relationship with Al, if not enthusiastic, was cordial. Sherwin Mizell, PhD, had become active in his recently completed Park Ridge neighborhood and was intensely interested in planning and zoning. The excesses and admissions of the rapid development in Bloomington during the 60s had brought the need for thoughtful infrastructure, setbacks, compatible uses, and other basics of land use planning to the fore. While the Hooker administration had agreed to zoning and planning and had instituted a rudimentary planning ordinance, the instances of spot zoning, lack of infrastructure requirements, and disregard of draining issues and green spaces continued unabated. Sherwin found himself at the forefront of the move to rein in these practices and saw only truly effective way to achieve this was running for city council from the East Side District. Professionally, Dr. Mizell, surely to his friends, was a professor in the medical sciences program at IU, teaching gross anatomy. Originally from Chicago, he had come to Bloomington in 1965. He had received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana and taught at the University of South Carolina and Creighton University. As a professor, Dr. Mizell emerged as a leader in his anatomy department, and as a member of the Jewish faith, he also found himself leading an effort to establish a local temple. He became a founding member of Beth Shalom, one of the only Hoosier Jewish temples south of Indianapolis. He decided to run for city council in District 3 as a Democrat and approached the political arena as a viable candidate, albeit without experience in party politics. Willana Smith, an activist in the mental health community and community corrections programs locally, ran against Mizell in the primary. She was known as an indefatigable proponent of community mental health care and addictions programs both locally and statewide. Willana would be a major force in developing a work release center in Bloomington, way before other communities embarked on such ventures. Her husband was a professor in the IU School of Education. She was one of the examples of the unacknowledged spouses who helped change the social service scene in Monroe County. Sherwin would trounce Willana in the 3rd District primary 392 to 90. The 4th District included the campus south of 10th Street and comprised a family neighborhood with a growing mix of students to the east and south. Like the 2nd District on the north side of the campus, it had been subjected over the last few years to a plague of spot zonings. Single-family homes were purchased by developers who then petitioned for rezoning as multifamily residential. Having seen this scourge devastate core neighborhoods in the city of Ann Arbor and witnessing very solid, attractive homes being bulldozed and replaced, I was moved to stop it. More importantly, I was amazed and stressed that there had been so little discussion of this phenomenon. In fact, it was the council's lack of debate, resistance to public participation during the meetings, and appearance of everything being predetermined that compelled me to decide to run for the council seat. I had never before considered running for office myself, but after spending the 1969-70 academic year in Czechoslovakia and witnessing the frailty of democratic movements abroad, I came home committed to doing what I could to maintain democracy at home. When Ed Tracy, the county chair, came to me and urged me to consider running because, he said, we needed to elect a woman, I demurred. What did I know about city government? He urged me to attend a meeting or two, do a little homework, and think about it. I went to a council meeting in the midst of a public fury over the proposed high-rise senior citizens apartment building on Kirkwood and Dunn. I watched, amazed, as the 9 white men marched into the meeting from the mayor's office, sat down, mystifyingly asked ordinances to be read by title only, and proceeded to ignore the many hands waving in the audience requesting a chance to speak. I was deeply offended and realized I could do better than that. I realized that many of the things I had found lacking in the city, the sidewalks, curbs, gutters, storm sewers, little parks, a vital downtown, even jobs, could be addressed by city government. Furthermore, I looked to government to be problem-solving, and the tone and activities of the council at the time showed little interest in defining problems, much less solving them. I decided that I could learn the details and threw my hat in the ring. Bill McGarry was my opponent in the 4th District primary. Bill's father had been a precinct committeeman in the past and was a well-known small businessman who ran an appliance repair service. Bill was following in his footsteps and was a supporter of Tom Lemon. However, he was not committed to an active campaign and not agnostic towards me. I supported McCloskey, but in a very low-key way, and did my best to remain on good terms with Tom Lemon. I campaigned hard, door to door, throughout the compact area that was the 4th District, and it paid off for the primary, as well as for the general election. I would win 521 to 124. After several years as a Methodist minister in Alabama, Herbert Davis brought his family to Bloomington to work with students out of University Ministries, a campus ecumenical program. Shortly after he got here in 1969, he placed a heap of boxes and papers he had used for moving in front of his house to be picked up by the city, but the heap was not picked up. In frustration, Herbert called the mayor's office and got no help. Infuriated by this, he too decided to do something about it. He touted up the many things he would like to see improved: mental health care, city-county government cooperation, public transportation, basic services. His experience in working with groups of people for the job made him alert to the lack of community building that he saw in the city. Herbert was involved in precinct politics. Herbert was involved in precinct politics as chair of the precinct Perry 5, so he had political experience, but he now decided to run for the council in the 5th District. Herbert had two competitors in the primary, a Campbell and an Ellison. They made no appearances beyond filing for offices. Final 5th District results were decisive for Davis, winning 350 votes, more than Campbell's 190 and Ellison's 77 combined. After teaching for several years at Stillman College in Alabama, Jack Ackerman was asked to develop a course on the Bible as literature in the nascent religious studies department at IU. Having a prodigious zest for life and a great joy in working with people, Jim was drawn to political activism in his new home, as he had been in Alabama. An ordained Presbyterian minister, Jim found government in Washington, D.C. almost easier to understand than it is to comprehend the whys and the wherefores of city government in Bloomington. The serious breakdown of communications and confidence between the people of Bloomington and their elected city officials provoked Jim into running to correct this situation. I often heard him say that the city was growing topsy-turvy with little or no planning. Furthermore, when the decisions are made on high, citizens whose neighborhoods are being affected are not consulted. Jim found this unacceptable. He decided to run for council in the 6th District. Bill Reich, an insurance agent who regularly voted Democratic, was Jim's opponent in the primary. He had not been particularly active and was not an ardent proponent of any position, but he was a solid citizen and generally comfortable with the status quo. Ackerman won in a walk, 653 to 141. And then there were the candidates for council at large. District candidates had to come from one of 6 defined geographic areas, and only voters living in those districts could vote for them. The 3 at-large candidates could live anywhere in the city and were voted on by all voters. 7 individuals ran for 3 at-large seats in the Democratic primary, and the 3 who emerged victorious were Richard Behan, Brian DeSucroix, and Wayne Fix. They were all very different persons in temperament, experience, and evident interest. They all, however, shared a desire to see change and to be part of it. Richard Dick Behan was best known as a shoe salesman at Alden's, a small department store on the square, and for portraying Abraham Lincoln in parades, and whenever he got the chance to don his high hat, beard, and black dress coat. Dick was tall and lanky and quite convincing in his role of the great president. One of the 2 council candidates who supported Tom Lemon in the primary, Dick was probably the most conservative of the group. A devout Roman Catholic, his views on social issues proved to be in stark contrast to his fellow candidates in key areas. He took great pride in his role as Grand Knight of the Knights of Columbus. However, Dick was not happy with the Hooker regime and shared a desire for more involvement of the citizenry in their government. Dick had moved to Bloomington in 1957 from his hometown of Sedalia, Missouri. He had served during World War II in the U.S. Navy and come to Bloomington to set up shoe departments in Wick's and later Alden's department stores. He relished his interactions with customers and especially in his role playing Lincoln for children in the schools. For him, people's participation in the government was very important. He described himself as appalled at the disregard the council had demonstrated toward the voice of the people. Wayne Fix came to the city election with a reputation for being deeply involved in the county land use and agricultural issues. He was a professional appraiser of farmland and agricultural properties donated to IU. He worked with the U.S. Soil and Water Conservation District and was committed to the conservation of natural resources. He was a self-described environmentalist when the term was just coming into wide use. The lack of serious attention to conservation and to sound environmental practices moved him to run, but the lack of public involvement in decision-making and the absence of city-county cooperation pushed him over the edge. Rounding out the at-large ticket, Brian DeSucroix was the youngest and most recently arrived resident to file. Brian, raised in the Boston area and the oldest of 6 children, had attended Northwestern University but left school to become a community organizer. He came to Bloomington to continue this line of work as a planner for the burgeoning Community Action Program and a consultant to a number of other organizations. Although only 23, he had developed exceptional organization skills and a talent for both public speaking and getting straight to the point. He not only was dismayed by the lack of public discussion of public issues, but the lack of initiative taken by members of the council. His rallying cry was, The community is suffering from a lack of strong, independent council that works for the community and whose function goes beyond that of a rubber stamp. In the Democratic primary, there were 4 candidates in addition. The top 3 vote-getters would become the official nominees for the fall election. Fix, 2,944, Dason Croy, 2,351, and Behan, 1,613 prevailed over Ketchen, 1,384, Hildbreder, 1,016, Alexander, 821, and Parker, 770. The additional names on the ballot. Of these, only Jim Hildbreder had been visibly active in the Lemon campaign, but after coming in 5th, he joined the McCloskey campaign with some energy and good effort. The other three never did more than file for the office. And what about the 1st district? While there were other primary battles in the spring of 1971, none of them was as vigorous or as tense as the 1st District Democratic primary. The Great Society, as noted above, had brought many programs to Bloomington, and with them the requirement that federally funded agencies have a good portion of the beneficiaries of the agency on their governing boards. The resulting empowerment of local low-income participants cannot be underestimated. Suddenly, they had a voice in making real decisions in the Community Action Program, Head Start, and the Housing Authority. One very articulate and vocal woman became a spokesperson for the Crestmont Center, a public housing development on the west side. Bobby Bennett understood the concerns of the tenants and did not fail to make them clear to the authorities. When encouraged by residents to run for city council in the 1st District, she did so, and she found support across the community for bringing her voice to the public arena. She campaigned hard and effectively, but she was not unopposed. Rodney Fawcett had been on the council under Tom Lemon, and the Lemon faction encouraged him to run against that woman from the projects. He did. An old-time resident of Monroe County, he could refer to his previous public service, his good job with Bell Telephone, his home ownership, and his union membership in the CWA to win the nomination. The primary election came to a tie vote, 276 votes, each for Bennett and Fawcett. As per the rules at the time, the county Democratic chair could establish how the tie would be broken. Ed Tracy was a Tom Lemon supporter in the primary. He chose to include not only the city precinct chairs in the tie-breaking caucus, but also precinct chairs from throughout the county. While many challenged this decision, Tracy had the right to make the decision. As Tracy had calculated, Fawcett was easily chosen as the candidate by the county Democrats who knew him from past and were not predisposed to nominate a woman from the Hill, the nickname most people had for the subsidized housing at the time. The first chance the Democrats had to run a low-income vocal woman for the council, they found themselves instead with an upstanding but very traditional man. We were on our way to changing and diversifying the party in town, and Tracy's machinations did serious damage to our goals. It was a regrettable turn of events then, and I regret it still. Fawcett would not campaign much. He was uncomfortable with public speaking, and he avoided being identified with some of the candidates on the ticket. It was an awkward situation. By the end of the second week in May, after the tie-breaking caucus, the slate was set. The candidates came together to begin strategizing for the fall. After much discussion, it was decided that County Chair Ed Tracy would not be asked to coordinate the city campaign. Rather, a seasoned political activist from labor studies at Indiana University, Dale Bricker, was suggested by Frank McCloskey and was chosen to lead the effort. Dale was numbers-oriented, which fit into the General Voters Union strategy, and the campaign got underway. In any situation where there are a number of candidates who come from different directions, there is always questions to whether or not they will run as individuals or combine their efforts into one relatively unified campaign. This mixed group spent a lot of time coping with that question, but eventually determined that they had the best chance of electing a majority by working together. That meant agreeing on the theme or slogan, developing a brochure or several brochures, coordinating schedules, organizing precinct activities, pitching in on fundraising, learning to know each other, and building trust and understanding among the disparate personalities involved. and building trust and understanding among the disparate personalities involved. We were launching a major effort to unseat an entrenched group of well-known local leaders, and we ourselves were new to the public scene. It was a daunting challenge, but we believed we had assessed the political landscape with open eyes and that we had something to offer. The results of the primary taught us that we had won because we had committed ourselves to working hard and connecting with the voters in the most direct way possible by getting out and listening to them. We would bring energy and ideas as well as a willingness to listen. We could improve upon the status quo. We landed on the theme, a better way, and we set to work. For many of the Republicans hoping to run for office that year, the primary election in the spring of 1971 was a big hurdle. The majority of the council members and the mayor had been in office for almost 8 years and had established a record. Records can be helpful or not, and the citizens of Bloomington took a hard look at what had and what had not had been accomplished. The evaluation started after the first Tuesday in May. Mayor Hooker was first elected in 1963 by defeating Mary Alice Dunlap. Mary Allison inherited the office when, as city clerk, she had been elected by the Democratic caucus in 1961 to replace Tom Lemon when he left the mayoralty to accept JFK's. Mayor Hooker was first elected in 1963 by defeating Mary Alice Dunlap. Mary Alice had inherited the office when, as city clerk, she had been elected by the Democratic caucus in 1961 to replace Tom Lemon when he left the mayoralty to accept JFK's invitation to be postmaster for the Cincinnati region. Mayor Dunlap had done a credible job and was a smart and friendly person. She was a native Bloomingtonian and, like Lemon, had been involved in real estate as the city was booming. But Hooker had been a history teacher at Bloomington High School and had been elected county commissioner at a Pleasant Manor and looked to many people the way they thought a mayor should look: tall, well-built, and male. He had been an active mayor and with many ideas and had been a supportive council. He had been an active mayor with many ideas, and he had a supportive council most of the years he was in office. He was not a delegator, and over time, his tendency to do what he felt needed to be done without asking for permission or dealing well with dissent wore thin. By the time of the 1971 primary, there were 3 council members who were in outright rebellion to Mayor Hooker. Furthermore, the county Republicans were split amongst themselves, with the county faction opposing Hooker and the city faction his loyalists. Add this to an acrimonious legal battle in which Hooker and his city controller, Howard Young, were indicted for illegal use of public funds, and you have the makings of a tense primary battle. This was further reflected in several of the council races as well, pitting Hooker's supporters against insurgents. Bill Lloyd, the preferred candidate of the county party, would turn out to be Hooker's most formidable challenger. But the mayor had 4 opponents in the 1971 mayoral election. The results had been alarming to the incumbent. Of 3,730 votes cast in the Republican primary, Hooker squeaked by with 1,297, barely 35% of the vote, to Lloyd's 1,259, 34%, followed by Ken Rumpel, 943, 25%, and 2 also-rans, Robinson 23 votes and Stannard 8 votes. Interestingly, Hooker gained the plurality in all the precincts in Perry Township, which is south of 3rd Street. Lloyd won all the precincts north of 3rd Street, the entirety of the city that was Bloomington Township. Much of the new development had risen south of 3rd Street and east of Walnut, while generally the growth to the north had been more affordable housing, with the notable exception of Blue Ridge, a large lot residential project built by Hooker's second competitor, Ken Rumpel. Hooker's prospects for the fall were not good, and there were strong signs that the Democrats were healing their internal rift, while the Republicans were holding their grudges. Among the Republican races, too, there were visible fractions in the solid front they had enjoyed. In the 1st District, Jack Morrison owned one of the largest retail appliance and repair businesses in town. A veteran of World War II, he had served in Germany with the Rangers, a radio communications unit that went behind the enemy lines and had a high casualty rate. Many of the Rangers were Native Americans, and Jack himself was half Oglala Sioux. He was proud of his heritage, but was not considered a social peer by many local Republicans. Over time, he had parted ways with Mayor Hooker and was not a rubber stamp for his policies and programs. At the same time, he lived on the west side in a historic Victorian house that he had refurbished. And he was a neighborly, outgoing, brusque but caring person, and he had a loyal following amongst the voters there. Many of them had television sets thanks to his financing plans for them. And he was called by many the mayor of the West Side. Although he had an opponent in a primary, a man named Michael, he won easily, 425 to 73. He would run a campaign independent of the other R's. The 2nd District seat was open. David Stimp, a local realtor, ran unopposed. He had been recruited by Hooker, who would likely support him. The same thing was true of the 3rd District, where Donald Nichols, a Bell Telephone executive, was running for an open seat and was also loosely in the Hooker camp. Dr. Harry Day, an eminent chemist on the faculty of IU and major figure in the development of Crest toothpaste, was running in the 4th District for his third term on the council. He was a staunch supporter of the mayor, a solid patriarch with a long list of connections in the Bloomington establishment. He ran unopposed. As I would soon get used to hearing during my own candidacy for the 4th District, people would say he was a nice man who would be hard to beat. Robert Clenning, the lone Democrat on the council, had decided to run for mayor, and thus the 5th District, as well as an open seat. It was a battleground. 3 candidates ran a tight race, and Edris Baker, a teacher, narrowly winning by 4 votes over R. Matthews, 230 to 226, and both outpolling a third Terrell, who won 107 votes. Idris was a mild-mannered, charismatic woman who was a painter and a strong supporter of Mayor Hooker, whose restrained approach to the headache days of student protests were big pluses for her, and she favored his support of planning. Probably the strongest opponent that Hooker had on the council was the member from the 6th District, Richard Dick Fee. A well-established insurance agent from a family firm, Dick was an analytical and thorough but combative. Together with Morrison and Clendenning, he represented the opposition to the current administration. He ran a tough primary against a very prominent woman, Mary Alice Gray, the wife of an English professor. She joined Harry Day as the lone Republican candidate directly connected with IU faculty. Mary Alice, the board member presiding over the construction of the new library, the advocate of the new consolidated school corporation, and an advocate of planning for the city, was a formidable community leader and ardent supporter of John Hooker. This race came down to the wire, but Dick squeaked by 442 to 414. At large, the candidate who emerged as the leader was Bud Ferris, the strongest supporter of the Hooker regime. Bud had steadfastly supported Hooker through thick and thin, and had been especially staunch in the serious brouhaha over the downtown high-rise apartment and land purchase. Although Bud ran an upscale butcher shop and grocery right downtown just north of the square on Walnut, most of his business was by delivery, and he supported the parking meter scheme that was to have funded the high-rise land project. This put him at odds with most of the downtown retail colleagues, but Bud was a local supporter of Phi Gamma Delta fraternity, aka the Fijis, and had a lot of connections with fraternities and sororities on campus. He was well entrenched in the community at many levels and probably the strongest of the at-large candidates in either party. He had been president of the council off and on for years. Robert Bud Clegg, another of the at-large candidate and owner of the Stony Crest Motel, was a solid Hooker supporter. His priority was planning, and he served on the newly formed City Planning Commission. He was very proud of the work the Hooker regime had done in this direction and hoped to see everything included in the planning process. Clyde Day, the third at-large candidate, had represented a district on council, serving the first 4 years of the Hooker regime, but was defeated in 1967 by Democrat William Madden. He was elected by the council to replace Madden when Bill left town for a teaching position at the University of Minnesota. Clyde Day was a Hooker supporter, but not very vocal, though he stressed communication in his written statements. He held transportation and recreational facilities high on his list of priorities and stressed the need for better than average schools, reasonable housing and property taxes, churches, and cultural opportunities to appeal to business people moving in with the proliferation of manufacturing plants. He came in third in the polling at the primary in the field of 9 candidates. Ferris 1,751, Clegg 1,567, Day 1,561, Weir 1,103, Euler 990, Profmer 780, Barbary 556, Matthews N 501, Finnegan 346. The Republicans amassed a number of votes, but they too had a number of novices on their ticket, at least 2 candidates who were publicly opposed to much of the mayoral candidate's record. The mayoral primary, as noted, was not friendly, and fence mending had to be high on their coming agenda. Re-electing the Republican administration seemed to many who were not paying close attention to be inevitable, but it was the time when much was up in the air, and a slam dunk was no longer a given. This meant the Republican slate for council would not be united and could be fractious within the group. The Republican slate, despite being weakened by division from the start, assumed success. They also might have assumed that no one would ever take the motley bunch of Democratic newcomers seriously. We believed that they were out of touch with the issues and concerned the electorate. We heard as much from people and knew that paying attention close to the electorate, we might just win. We certainly didn't take it for granted, but we knew we had a shot.